So, good morning again, everybody. It gives me great pleasure to introduce my colleague, Claire Garnier-Tardieu, who's giving the third and final keynote address of the conference. Claire is a beloved and esteemed colleague, a professor of English didactics at the Sorbonne Nouvelle, but Claire also has a secret life as a poet. She's the author of many collections of poetry. She is the treasurer of the Poésie Première group. She is the living, breathing life force behind this conference because she wrote her PhD thesis on the work of Kathleen Raine. It was called La tradition de l'Éden dans l'Autobiography et l'œuvre poétique de Kathleen Raine, which she did with under the supervision of another esteemed colleague, Jacqueline Jeunet from the University of Caen. Recently, Claire has translated some of Kathleen Raine's works, which have been published, and she is also the author of an essay called Le Voyage Poétique de Kathleen Raine. And in the spring of 2019, she was a visiting professor at the University of Austin, Texas, where she lectured on English Romantic and contemporary poetry. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce her for this illuminating talk.
Thank you so much, Elena. That was too much. So thank you everybody for being here today, and I'm honored by your presence. Dear colleagues, dear friends from the Temenos Academy, dear students, I have chosen to focus on the first 3 volumes of Kathleen Raine's autobiography to question the way in which she succeeds in continually transporting us from the level of a life story to a universal, mythical dimension. So first of all, I need to clarify some terms. Autobiography is generally understood to be the written account of one's own life. Autobiography, it's not very convenient, with all the papers. Try to not to make too much noise with papers. Autobiography is generally understood to be the written account of one's own life in its most personal aspects, to which we must add the pact of sincerity, if not of truth, that underpins it. Autobiography differs from memoir, which is written by leading figures and relates mainly to external events experienced by the author, such as the memoirs of de Gaulle or Churchill, for example. Autobiography also differs from diaries, which are written from day to day without critical distance, or from correspondence whose literary character is more or less intentional and which directly appeals to a targeted otherness. The 20th century saw the emergence of Nouvelle critique and nouveau roman with the death of the author, an expression coined by Roland Barthes, and the advent of autofiction, as Serge Dubrovsky phrased it in the 1970s, to denounce the pretense of truthfulness and sincerity in autobiographies, of which Rousseau's Confessions is the archetype. Je forme une entreprise qui n'eut jamais d'exemple et dont l'exécution n'aura point d'imitateur. Je veux montrer à mes semblables un homme dans toute la vérité de la nature. Et cet homme, ce sera moi. Questioning the very purpose of Kathleen Raine's autobiography should help to define it within a genre that is precisely ill-defined, even abused. From Farewell Happy Fields to The Land Unknown and The Lion's Mouth, I will examine the reason for this type of writing at a time in Kathleen Raine's life when, in her own words, her life had stopped. Gavin Maxwell, her great impossible love, had just married someone else, a short-lived marriage, but one that seemed to seal what she experienced as a form of deep betrayal. She writes, I began to write at a moment when my own story seemed to have come to an end. And 12, if it is 12 years later, this still seems to have been so in a certain sense. At the time of the actual writing, Kathleen Raine was only 54 years old. She adds, but when experience ends, the understanding of what we have experienced and done has scarcely begun. That penultimate judgment in which we are ourselves judged and accused and sole witness. Is her 3-volume work similar to Confessions or to the Egyptian Book of the Dead, and should it be located in the literary genre to which it belongs? The year 1962 was also the year when she left Girton College, the college of her youth, where since 1955, as a research fellow and subsequently as a lecturer, she'd been studying the Romantics, including Coleridge and more significantly William Blake, who became her guide. A few years later, this led to the sumptuous edition of Blake and Tradition in the Bollington series, 1968. Greville Lindop writes, like all great scholars, Kathleen Raine was changed by that which she studied. I also believe that, steeped in the Christian, Platonic, Neoplatonic and esoteric traditions that she had discovered through Blake, she was confirmed in her childhood intuitions. She'd been given the end of a golden string that is the right grid to bring together the scattered elements of her life and make them meaningful. How indeed, without relying on the ancient tradition of Sophia Perennis, can one give an account of events that are not experienced at a purely material level of reality, but simultaneously on other planes of consciousness that are equally graspable by those two primordial faculties, memory and imagination, the anamnesis of the true nature of the self and the imagination that recreates and perpetuates it. The originality of Kathleen Raine's autobiography lies precisely in this totally unique and accurate analytical grid, which emerged in a century where the usual interpretations were Marxist, structuralist, or psychoanalytical. This has led me to wonder to what extent Raine's autobiography really belongs to its century, or whether it has freed itself from a return to the previous century, the 19th, so as to project itself into a more receptive future, the 21st century and beyond. So to answer this question, I suggest the following path. So first of all, the autobiographical project. In her introduction to Farewell Happy Fields, written on the 10th of January 1973, Kathleen sets out the type of autobiography she intends to deliver to the reader. First of all, she explained that it is a text written 12 years earlier. The introduction thus operates a double shift in time in relation to life, but also to the writing of life. She recalls what presided over the decision to write about her childhood and then her adulthood in a narrative of her own. It consisted in recording what she wished to preserve from her life. So the question of truth is very important. The literary genre of autobiography came under particular attack in the 20th century, as I alluded to earlier, mainly with regard to the notion of sincerity, which was undermined by the theory of the psychoanalytic unconscious, but also by structuralism and other trends. Such a questioning of traditional autobiography, taken up by Federman or Robbe-Grillet, and in general by the proponents of an autotelic literature, can be summarized in this quote from Gasparini. Federman and Robbe-Grillet do not reject autobiography as a narrative of personal experiences, but the hypothesis of an autobiographical pact that would guarantee the truth of this narrative. This critique of the genre itself does not seem to apply to Kathleen Raine's work, because its purpose is not to find the truth of its story, but the mythical truth beyond the story. In this case, the author is well aware that memory is constructed, that events can be forgotten or falsified. But this doesn't mean that her autobiography is devoid of truth. She writes, Who, in any case, can distinguish between a real event and what we only thought or felt it to be? Facts melt away as we examine them, and their apparent materiality dissolves into thoughts, feelings, insights. What other facts are there than these? And what, for that matter, is a world but a mode of consciousness? Times and places, mountains and seas and houses and cities, all these are only the lived experience of those who inhabit them. The world is continuously woven of our thoughts. There is no other. So she echoes an image presented by C.S. Lewis, namely that of hills that look different depending on whether one is climbing them or turning around to look at their rich line. Both visions are real and true. Autobiographical writing leads to the quest for true self to bring about that moment of encounter with oneself that she calls a homecoming, with the feeling of having reached the perfect rendezvous in terms of time and place. So, the only element that matters to Kathleen Raine is the preservation of beauty. So much beauty, so many marvelous things have slipped away unrecorded. For she knows that beauty is truth and truth beauty. And perhaps this is why she didn't want to keep two negative poems in her collection, as Gravel mentioned yesterday. So, the right grid. If one were to take up one principle of the proponents of self-fiction, it would be that the author is always writing from a value system of his own. True autobiographies like the Cartesian idea are clear and distinct, provided, of course, that one has the right critical instrument, that one applies the right grid, they say. So what might the right grid be in Kathleen Raine's case, if not that of myth? A quasi-spiritual approach which aims to bring out a mythical identity beyond the singular one seems to go against the grain of the critical work typical of the 20th century. Could it be then that it opens up a third, even more modern way? Philip Villen's reflection would thus be more likely to place it in the contemporary era. For Villen, there are two possible conceptions of the writing of the self. The first, privileging the fidelity of a historical relationship to the self. The second, claiming the novelistic recreation of the self, and with it, the sincerity of the relationship to the self, based on the impossibility of describing oneself. This last conception seems to be applicable to Raine's approach, whose writing forges a character, a persona, that strives to reveal the underlying myth, the common thread beyond the individual heroic destiny, in order to give it a universal meaning. In this sense, it is not self-centered, nor does it reject the literary quality, nor does it claim to understand the facts as such. In this first introduction, Kathleen Raine announced that her project consists in writing as one seeks not to remember dates or raw facts, but to make oneself emerge as the other that one is no longer, that one may have been, a self reconstructed through the web of events and which will become oneself. She writes, however, in the course of time, we come a little into our own. We begin to see reflected in the seemingly fortuitous succession of events the inner pattern of our own nature, of what was predestined for us through what we are. Only when it has reflected that inner order can what has befallen us be truly called our life. Here, the reader is reminded of the distinction made by the philosopher Paul Ricoeur between identity of the idem type and identity of the ipse type. The former is that of permanence in time, which makes us retain a self through the different ages of life, a kind of identity core which also makes others recognize us, whereas identity in the sense of ipse does not imply any assertion concerning a supposedly unchanging core of the personality. For Kathleen Raine, writing the self as another, ipse, is a way of seizing an irreducible primary meaning that would be the true self in the sense of idem, the epitome of ipse, its intrinsic nature. She uses the term pattern, which can evoke a drawing, a path, the tracing of a destiny, like a stone to be grasped in the hand, according to the beautiful image forged by Diane de Margerie. She rejects the mundane writing that would be interested in encounters with famous personalities or journalists that are inappropriate outside oneself, like images seen through the train window. As she suggests in the following lines, I have been most myself when alone and writing. If the autobiography is bound to deal with another self, or rather a no longer self, a self that is no longer, therefore, ultimately, with constructing a specific character as for a novel, it is to better grasp one's lost universal identity. In a sense, as Daniel Maddalena says, every autobiographical narrative is imbued with a mythical vocation. So although her approach is in contrast with that of the 20th century, far from being anachronistic, it forms part of a literary tradition that is still valid. And I would like to mention here Aurélia, ou Le Rêve et la Vie by Gérard de Nerval, which also refers to this desire to call upon myth in order to speak more clearly about the human soul, about his soul. And of course, there are clear links with to Dante's Divine Comedy or Apelles' Golden Ass. But what is meant by myth? Myth does not refer here to a construct of the mind, the fruit of the imagination, having no link with reality, as dictionaries may put it. Myths tell the truth that is not contingent on a given culture or time, but which expresses the great human archetypes. Mircea Eliade's work, Myths, Dreams and Mysteries, largely contributed to the emergence of this last meaning. I read, myths reveal the structures of reality and the multiple modes of being in the world. This is why they are the exemplary model of human behavior. They reveal true stories referring to realities. But ontophany always implies theophany or hierophany. It is the gods or semi-divine beings who created the world and founded the innumerable modes of being in the world, from that which is particular to man to the mode of being of the insect. By revealing the history of what happened in Illud tempore, one reveals at the same time the sacred bursting into the world. Kathleen Raine herself writes in On the Mythological, as a child I became a confirmed believer in the ancient gods, simply because between the reality of fact and the reality of myth, I chose myth. For her, myth is about experience, an experience that unfolds on the mirror of consciousness and connects the natural with the divine. On the myth of Demeter and Persephone, she writes, thus, the story of Demeter and Persephone tells, upon the natural level, of the sowing and harvesting of corn, on the psychological level, of the death and resurrection of the individual soul, symbolized by Persephone, daughter of the divine reason, Demeter, and on the theological of an aspect of the relation of the divine to the human world. In other words, myth is the truth of the fact, not fact the truth of the myth. Myth thus fulfills an essential function in that it is repeatable and allows for the expression of otherwise unutterable human realities. For Kathleen Raine, true images are symbols that give access to other planes of reality. As for the writing itself, it always involves a time lag. Interestingly, Ricoeur explains since Augustine conception of time in terms of distantio animi, that is, the dispersion, the distension of the soul towards the past and the future, in a present that is always fleeing. And intention, which is the gathering of the self towards the one. Ricoeur also places the notion of distinctio animi in contrast with Aristotle's mythos, the plotting, which is the arrangement of facts into a system. The key issue here is that of mimesis, or the representation of facts or experience. For Aristotle, the mythical narrative is a distortion. Thus, according to Vasilakou-Facea, without denying the tradition of the gods or the great origin myths, Aristotle considers the mythical narrative or the form given to the myth as persuasive additions devised by theologians in a kind of falsification. In other words, the mythos is opposed to the logos, that is, logical reasoning, already in Plato. Raine's autobiography is situated precisely at the crossroads of myth and story, between the act of telling and the act of recreating the timelessness of myth through imagination. But how can the truth of a life emerge without in some way falsifying it by the very fact of this putting into narrative, of this gap between experience and the writing of experience? It seems that Raine's approach takes the opposite path to that of the philosopher Aristotle, whereas the latter seeks to demystify myth by confronting it with reality. The poet seeks to construct a narrative capable of confronting reality with myth without mystifying it. Paradoxically, this is similar to the work of the novelist, able to transform a realistic setting, Babington, Ilford, Cambridge, Martinelli, London, Sunday, into a mythical setting that escapes chronology, a land of Eden or exile. One might think that it is this attitude that prevails in the first volume, Farewell Happy Fields. On the other hand, her approach seems to be close to that of the historian who presides over the writing of the two following volumes, The Land Unknown and The Lion's Mouth. India Sinafar will not be dealt with in this lecture. So in the introduction to those last two books, Kathleen Raine explained that she took the liberty of modifying the last chapters. I read, "The greater part of this book stands as I originally wrote it, but in the later sections, especially, there have been subtraction and additions. I too have changed, and cannot describe beliefs of a former time as if I still held them." This passage offers further evidence that autobiographical writing is always a rewriting of the self, a form of palimpsest writing. Raine is not only looking for the inner pattern, as in the first volume, but rather for the flaw, the misdirection, the journey of life, as if it were a matter of life and death. To write my story, to retrace my life, as an attempt to discover when and why I had lost the thread, and what the pattern was that I broke, and even some possibility of finding the lost clue again. This third volume is even more complex than the second, because it was written in 3 stages. In 1962, when the poet felt the vital urgency to write what was unbearable to live. In 1966, when she added a conclusion, from page 141 to page 163, and in 1977, when she wrote this introduction. But whatever the nature of the writing, it always appears as an attempt to tear the narrative away from the triviality of events in order to seek the myth, that totality which will give them true meaning. And this brings to mind the Bayeux tapestry, which is presented in 3 levels. In the middle is the heroic story, which takes up the most space. At the bottom is the frieze of everyday life, and at the top, the celestial frieze, with its chimeras and fabulous animals. The question now is how Raine's autobiographical writing manages to span the divide between ordinary and extraordinary life, which gives it a universal dimension capable of carrying the reader with it. I believe that it is the heroism of the writing itself, constantly navigating between narrative and myth, which manages precisely to save the singular story by transforming it into a universal story, or rather by revealing it as such. It is the journey of a woman and a poet that awakens in each reader a familiarity, what Kathleen Raine calls the kinship of Eden. In this, far from the reductionist conceptions of the 20th century, an innovative spiritual dimension of the autobiographer's work is affirmed as she takes on the responsibility of revealing a plane of reality shared by all. What is this work of the autobiographer? How does Raine's pen move between story and myth? That's what we're going to see now. What time is it, please? Fine. So Raine's autobiography is seeped with references to several great myths, as Céline Boyer suggests in her thesis. First of all, the Garden of Eden and the Tree of Life, as well as the River of Life. This myth refers to the Bible and to Kathleen Raine's Presbyterian education, but also and above all, as we shall see, to Platonic and Neoplatonic philosophy, Plato and Plotinus, and to the great myths of origin, such as the Garden of Eden. She often mentions Demeter and Persephone, married to the god of the underworld, Hades, but also Psyche and Cupid, or Isis and Osiris, with the issues of dislocation, loss, and the quest for reconstruction of the self. However, it seems that the myth of the Garden of Eden tops all the others and naturally integrates the one that also takes a prominent place in the autobiography, namely Demeter and Persephone, whose function is precisely to give meaning to the exile and the loss of paradise. It is to be noted that hell refers both to the hells of Greco-Latin mythology, especially in the first volume of the autobiography, but also to Dante's, with both ancient, Aeneid, and Christian, or specifically in the London Note, connotations. As for Eden, present in the first volume, it is also present in the third volume with the figure of the Tree of Life. These two founding myths cross two traditions, the Judeo-Christian tradition and the ancient Greek tradition. They seem to correspond to the notion of monomyth that Céline Boyer outlined while drawing on the work of Joseph Campbell. The latter divides the monomyth into three phases. The first corresponds to separation, fragmentation, demantling, descent. The second is initiation by the komoi and hypocurrent, that is by song and dance, but also by the hierophants, who initiate the trainees into the sphere of the sacred and the secret. And finally, the last movement, which is rebirth, palingenesis, emergence. While the phases of the monomyth seem to capture the movement of Catherine's life quite well, her autobiography seems to suggest the replicability of the process. Indeed, the alternation between Eden and exile, paradise and hell, is constantly repeated throughout the autobiographical narrative, thus coming closer to the global myth of Demeter and Persephone. Yes, thank you. According to which, let us recall, the young woman is condemned to spend 6 months on earth and 6 months in the underworld. So, chapter 1 of the first volume of the autobiography opens surprisingly with a dream, and not with the date and place of birth, the dream of the River of Life. And this is less an illusory dream than a primordial memory. And I think that Jenny already alluded to it yesterday. It is really beautiful. I'm not going to read it all, but just the beginning. There was in the very beginning, I remember, a place of perfect happiness, radiant with the Easter sun, pure living light, pure living warmth. I knew my place for it much with my being. It was the beginning of a dream that kept coming back to me in my early childhood, the dream, no doubt, of my birth into the world. And of course, the dream goes on and it goes past beautiful meadows with flowers bathed in bright light. This is very important in the myth of Demeter and Persephone. So, just a little lost, sorry. Yeah. So in the beginning was the dream and the bliss, and this is an experience in itself, an original founding experience that the autobiographer links to the myth of Eden and Paradise. The dream of the river of life can similarly be compared with the myth of the generation of the souls in the parable of Er, son of Arminius from Pamphylia, reported by Plato in Book 10 of the Republic, which insists on the passage through the waters of Lethe, where thirsty souls drink in oblivion before choosing their lot and luminously penetrating the sensible world. Here, the river of life of the dream and the Garden of Eden will undergo precious avatars in a kind of inventing mythical geography, which tell the real truth, the one that cannot be summed up in the phrase of everyday life. The first and probably the most exemplary appears in Farewell Happy Fish under the name of Babington. So here are some photos of Babington. You can see the months here where she lived with her aunt during the First World War. And this is the back of the church, but she used to go to put flowers, as was told yesterday as well. This is the church, a small church, tiny one, very nice. This is the school, right? And this is the path to the moor from the church, on the back of the church. Okay. As we said yesterday, she writes from Babington to Ilford. I was born at 6 Gordon Road, Ilford, on the 14th of June 1908. So this appears on page 79. So she devotes the first 70 pages of her autobiography to Babington, as if it occurred before Ilford. So it's a twist, it's a trick, okay, like that one of a novelist. But in fact, it is not just for simple fiction. It's a ontological necessity, right? So I'm not going to read everything. So this is Babington, Red Babington, although it has only 9 houses, and there is little Babington just underneath, so you can imagine what little Babington is. Okay, so yes, so you can see what the autobiographer does here. You know, the liberty that she takes. I would like just to quote Christine Jordis, who will join us this afternoon, and she said, "La mémoire du paradis se confond avec un lieu terrestre." That's particularly true in the case of Kathleen Raine. So I'm not going to mention all I wrote on flowers because it's been done brilliantly yesterday. So I just go on, right? And just want to read this quote. "I understand that it is to my mother I owe the happiness of my infancy, as I remember or have since imagined it." So this is just to ponder over the fact that the Demeter and Persephone myth is prominent in her work. Okay, so here is a photo of her parents. So you can see Jessie Raine, beautiful, isn't she? And George Raine, very smart, and Kathleen, probably age 2. Okay, so yeah, I know it's I'm not sure, 2 or 3, I don't know. I'm not very good at young children, right? So she says, "Thank God I had a poetic mother." What was that compelling imperative secretly implanted in me by my mother, who, before I could hold a pencil, wrote down my infant poems? So Kathleen constantly links Jessie to her native paradise. Babington is on the northern side of Hadrian's Wall. That is the original Scotland from which she came, the great matriarchal Scotland. It is also in Babington that the poet's identity is revealed, or rather enacted. Kathleen Raine recounts an episode in which her mother and aunt go for a walk to Sweethope's farm for tea, promising to take her to her favourite spot, an anthropomorphic cliff called the Wild Hills of Wani. After tea, however, the 2 women turn back. But the pushcar was turned round, myself crying and struggling. At last, poetry came to my aid, and I fell into a chant, repeating the magic phrase over and over until the words became a sort of mantra. I want to go to the Wild Hills of Wani. By incantation, I tried to bring near the far bright beauty of the hills. in need of magic for so specific an end, I discovered the hues of poetry. Okay. Alright, so again, flowers, it just go on. Yes, I just wanted to mention a quote by Brian Keeble from the Temenos Academy, who said that the epiphanic visions that she had were the theophanic immediacy of truth and beauty present in the immediacy of pure perception. And I think it's particularly true. So, this Edenic existence, which in ancient myth corresponds to Persephone's life in Olympus, is of course counterbalanced by numerous episodes of loss and oblivion of the true self, stays in exile in the underworld, which I do not have time to develop here, following the myth of Demeter and Persephone, her being exiled in Ilford, Cambridge and then London, as opposed to living in Eden, in Bavington, Martindale and Sunday. In contrast to her mother, the figure of Demeter, goddess of the harvest, and here goddess of the war, stands Hades, her father, portrayed as the man of exile, the man of reason who taught English literature and preached austere sermons in the Methodist Church at Cranbrook Park. So the disparity between a mother for whom truth was imagination, was beauty, was nature, and a father who embodied the moral law of John Wesley's Methodism was emphasized by Raine on numerous occasions as well. And she says, of and into this disparity I was born, my inheritance an irreconcilable conflict of values to which my parents dared never confess, or did not, perhaps, consciously recognize. However, this disparity was an asset for Kathleen Raine, who inherited both her mother's poetic sensitivity and her father's philosophical spirit. Now let us examine what I mean by a heroic form of writing. The writing of autobiography is not only heroic because it features an accused character, especially in the third volume, but also and above all because it fights a real battle against the easy pen, the pen of the narrative, in order to gain a higher and wider level of meaning and awareness. So I'm going to show you how Raine transforms the story into myth. For that purpose, I will use colors: blue for narrative discourse, orange for explanatory discourse, and purple for mythical discourse. So here is an extract from her volume. The scene takes place in Bavington, and this is the bull, so the bull story. So here is the ordinary pen, I would say. One day, I think in March, this is no more than an impression of a clear, cold, sparse day of early spring, the news passed round among us that the bull had brought the farmer, not fatally, as it happened, for his eldest son, a boy of 13, and still one of the back row pupils in my aunt's schoolroom, had arrived on the scene in time to save his father's life. But the butcher had been sent for, and the bull was to die. So here the event is narrated as a news reporter might do. This is the lower phase, the level of the story. In the next paragraph, the reader is invited to move from the level of a banal story to the level of myth by the use of the terms acropolis, amphitheater, and the emphatic inversion here, you can see on the slide. This places the reader in the midst of Greek tragedy, in full empathy with the god or hero who is going to die. In this third extract, the autobiographer introduces an intermediary distance level, as it were, typical of intellectual or explanatory discourse, in orange here. Okay? For instance, she says, behind the immediate crime, the attack upon man, lay who knows what remote echo of archaic man's profound self-condemnation of his own animal nature. Okay? Then, at the end, she says, but to me, the pity was greater than the terror. I was on his side, and she starts identifying with the sacrificial bull. And the final extract I wanted to show you is really convincing, I think. I saw his pepper and salt purplish brown hide with a sense of infinite compassion. I was him, My body suffered in itself the death of the beast. My skin, mourning for its skin, my veins for its vein, my 5 senses for his. And when from his anus slipped a mass of feces, I was ashamed for the abasement of his death. So this sends us, back to Mithras and the ancient, the identification with this sacrificial bull as in the ancient cults of Cybele or Mithras, and it becomes physical and total. So the function of autobiographical writing is clearly visible here, as it constantly links 3 levels: the level of the ordinary story, the level of the intellect or the essay type, explanatory, and the level of the imagination, which refers to tragedy and the great myths of civilizations. The recurring processes are visible in one of the manuscripts of the Lion's Mouth that I was able to consult at the Harry Ransom Center at the University of Austin in Texas in 2019. So Kathleen Raine wrote in ink on large lined notebooks, reserving the left-hand page for any corrections or additions. She sometimes pressed flowers between the pages. So I'm going to show you some processes. So the first one is the refusal of ease or triviality. So this is excerpt number 1. Because these things had come to me and sought, I thought them heaven sent, and thee also sent by that world, both for his good and mine. So this is, thee means Gavin, okay, and thee is borrowed from the novel Voss, that was published sometime around, the 1960s, and she uses a sort of pseudonym to mention him. But then, it becomes in the final text, because these things had come to me and sought, the vision of the tree, the meeting with Gavin like a messenger from home, I thought them heaven sent. The incision seems to erase an overly intimate reflection. V refers to Gavin, a messenger from home, in a formula that is both more explicit and metaphorical. Second excerpt. It is the same will of the author to delete an expression too trivial. We see indeed the yolk and white of the one shell, which is not found in the final version. Right. Now, another procedure is the search for precision. It's clear that Raine rephrases certain passages, revealing a desire to refine the thought and to define as well as possible the meaning she wants to convey. This extract from the manuscript, page 83, seems to be taken up in a more synthetic and thoughtful way in the final version. I'll show you here. Okay, so on the left page, you can see that what she put instead of the across part, right? So, I seemed at that time to live rather in that world than in this. And she crossed, yet I see now that I received from him far more than I gave, since I received from him the power of giving, which truly is more blessed than to receive. And so she changed it for, yet all I gave thee was little in comparison with what through him I had received, the opening of the world and imagination, the return to paradise. And on the right-hand side, the final version. I seemed at that time to live rather in that world than in this, so the first sentence is kept as it was. And perhaps for a while I really had found unaware some magical secret, but this replaces the part of the world of imagination. Yet, in retrospect, I see that my belief that I was the giver was all illusion. It was I who, through Gavin, received riches and toil. Okay, so you see here, the mention of in retrospect underlines the work of the autobiographer who wants to capture as closely as possible not a reality that is forever fixed, but a reality captured at a given moment of writing, with a possible change of perspective in the course of time. Ipse again. Right? And the final procedure I found was called it restructuring. She also reorganizes the structure of the text. The rest of the above-mentioned manuscript appears on page 14 of the final version. It seemed that Raine wanted to place the vision of the tree earlier in the story as a primary statement, an indisputable axiom. This vision appears on page 15 and 16. I deleted it, I think. Oh, sorry. How can I go back? Is it not? Yes. Because we mentioned the hyacinth vision yesterday. So, she says, as I had once held my breath to see the flow of immortal life in a hyacinth, so did I see the tree, though it stood in inner space, not in nature. May tree or rolling tree, it bore its clusters of white flowers. In it was a blackbird, and at the foot the sleeping figure of a young boy about 12 years old. And everything then is the dream of this young boy, okay, the flowing of life and the rebirth, etc. So this description of the vision of the rolling tree mentions a number of elements of the poem written a few days later. This is one version of the vision, just as the following poem is another, and this is just a part of it, okay? So the same vision scene is replayed poetically, both in the autobiography and again in Life at Sunday, and again in the autobiography in a kind of subtle entanglement. So in fact, one day she goes out, she's in Sunday, and she sees the tree in front of Gavin's place, the same tree as in her dream. So there is a sort of magic synchronicity between her dream, the writing of the poem, the vision of the real tree in real life in Sunday. And so I was also finding very interesting the fact that the references to, she mentions, I call it a palimpsest writing. So even more fascinating are the references to writing, the process of being written, that are scattered throughout Kathleen Raine's autobiography. For example, the writing of the poem Northumbrian Sequence at Ellen Sutherland's house in Cocklemore a few days after the vision of the tree. So here you have the vision of the tree in London, the fact, then the writing of the poem Northumbrian Sequence at Cocklemore, then writing about the vision of the tree in London in Cocklemore, then still in Cocklemore, some years later, the writing about the writing of the poem in Cocklemore. So it's a sort of mise en abîme, I would say, right? Okay, I'm going to conclude now. So at the Harry Ransom Center, Kathleen Raine's manuscripts are recorded under the title Epiphanies. The title the poet had chosen at the beginning. It is a beautiful title that captures the life and writing journey of Kathleen Raine, a kind of Persephone who lives in exile from the happy meadows, but is allowed to tread them intermittently, to relive this perpetual springtime with Demeter, thanks to her epiphanic revelations and her love of poetry. It is the heroic writing of autobiography, some would call it the writing of the imaginal, as Henri Corbin, that creates this perpetual dynamism of embodied life. It constitutes both the means and the end, the process and the result, the ethanol and the work. This writing of the creative imagination gives all its power to autobiography, which is not a work of memory alone, nor a self-fiction, but a properly symbolist work, as Michel Duclos defends. Not French symbolism which sticks to random images, but the symbolism of metaphors that gives access to the experience of totality, that of the romantic poets from William Blake to Keats or Shelley. We shall do wrong if we think of symbols as single poetic images used to obtain some literary effect. Rather, symbol is a language in each of whose parts a whole is implied, and each symbol, in some measure, makes known to us that whole, as a whole, and in its wholeness. This is in keeping with Joseph Mill's conception of a cosmic order, and with Annick Johnson's PhD research on poetry and transcendency. And this is what makes Raine's autobiography so modern, so properly avant-garde, capable of renewing a genre by instilling in it the spiritual, even cosmic dimension that was so lacking in 20th century art. As for the writing itself, it marries several levels of reality in a constant concern to raise the reader's gaze to a form of universal identity, not limited to the sphere of the self, not to the span of a single life. In the end, extracting oneself from the judgment of others, building an identity that has overcome the trials of life, is heroic in itself. This is not the function of autobiography alone. Poetic writing, of course, plays this role, but in a different way. Poetry doesn't need to justify itself. Autobiography does. The proof that autobiography has fulfilled its heroic mission, so to speak, is that the poet will devote the 30 or so years she has left to her philosophical poetic work, as if freed from the weight of her life. Thank you very much. And this is the bibliography.
Thank you very much, Claire, for a talk that was extremely informative, but also very moving. I think very moving to see the photographs of the young Kathleen, and also to see her manuscripts. I'm always fascinated by the documentary evidence of a writer's process, and I think you explained that and outlined it very well. I have loads of questions for you, but perhaps just one, and then we can throw the questions open to the floor. How many manuscripts are there in the Harry Ransom Centre, and is it just her just her autobiography, or do you also have the poems?
I'm not sure because I didn't have time to go through all of them, of course, but there are lots of them, and especially there were several ones of the same book. So it's because I several volumes, and I just read some of them, but I didn't have time because I was working there, of course, and I didn't have much time. And when I discovered in this fantastic place that they had manuscripts from all over the world, I just typed Kathleen Raine, and I discovered that they had those volumes of autobiography, and I said, wow. And so I just went there, and I tried to take some pictures, and I had a very bad camera, and but I intend to go back, of course, and to do more work on those, because they're truly wonderful. And as you saw, in one of them there were some flowers that she pressed, so it was really moving for me. Thank you for this question.
So do we have questions from the floor? Yes.
I missed, where is that archive located?
It's located at the Harry Ransom Centre. So it's part of the university where I went for a semester in 2019. It's a place which is just amazing. You can find manuscripts from Victor Hugo, Baudelaire, Keats, Shelley, Blake. It's so moving, to see John Keats' letters to her brother after the death of another brother, and you just want to cry. I mean, it's so beautiful. And my students cried. My Texan students, they cried, really.
Sorry, but which university is it connected with?
It's the University of Texas at Austin.
Oh, Texas.
Yes, I know.
That's where you're going. Yes.
We all have to go there. It's a really good place. Next time we will hold a conference in Austin.
Jessica.
It's not so much a question, but a comment. What comes across for me on listening to you and also thinking about yesterday is that Kathleen Raine was constantly looking for meaning, and it's a constant search for self-definition also through symbols, but also through, and what I find particularly interesting, but I haven't quite worked out, so is that these symbols are very much alive and real.
Yeah.
Whereas in literature, symbols, if you think of Yeats, for instance, for me, if I remember, more abstract, whereas for Kathleen Raine, they're very much rooted in nature and in the myth of Demeter, which comes up again and again. And that's what I find very striking, this search for bearings, which I think we're all looking for our bearings, except that it's incessant, it's constant on her part, and these symbols are not at all abstract, but very real, and also real because of her experiencing of them, well, not of them, but of these epiphanies.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, she's yes.
I think
we don't attach the same meaning to symbol in France. I mean, when we think of Rimbaud, Baudelaire, it's very different. But for the romantic poets and for Raine in particular, I think that they are alive. Symbols are alive. They are living, dynamic forms, and of the imaginaire. That's a concept forged by Henri Corbin, who studied Islam a lot, and he forged this concept, imaginaire, which is not imagination, it's like an organ of life, okay, sort of, which makes us, it's an approach to life, it's a mode of living, where everything is alive. I think we said it yesterday with the flower. Each flower was a face, is a face. I think Sam and Sonia evoked this. So she taught her granddaughter to look at each flower, and she said, "Look, it's a face. It's a living being." And I don't think that she's looking for meaning. For the sake of meaning, that's not her quest at all. I think she's looking for the mystery of life itself, as we all are, I guess. When she studied botanic, or when she writes poems, she's just I think she is trying to reach that oneness, which is the whole of the universe, in fact. But it's a sort of quest, a sort of spiritual quest, but it's not just for meaning in itself.
But it is meaningful. I mean, even the experience of an epiphany is fully meaningful. It fills you up.
It fills you up.
You have a different connection with reality after.
Yeah. It's a sort of enlightenment. I would connect this to Buddhism, in fact, when you feel at one with everything which is around you. So she experienced that several times in her life. And so language is a poor vector for that. And she knows that. She said that she would have liked to write much better, although we find that this was quite good already. Okay, I think we have to start.
Perhaps we can continue this conversation around a cup of coffee.